Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Friday night and another live ghost stories by the Fireside. Let me move over here a little bit. It's kind of more like the fire front at the rate I was sitting. All right. Let me give a second for anyone to jump on that wants to jump on. In the meantime, I will go ahead and steal the music. The music is Diver Banton Kinderivas. The name of the song is Catharsis. Phenomenal album. And Dusk and Void became alive. Love the piano work there. Anyway, welcome everyone. I'm trying to get everything still sorted out a little bit. I had some things I had to get taken care of tonight, so running a little behind. However, in that, here we are. Alright. Anyway, I hope everyone had a wonderful week. Tonight's episode, Mysteries of the Night, is brought to you by the EbbenStoneTower.com, which is under construction, and if all goes well, should be up and running by the last quarter of 2021. It'll be the Ebbenstone Tower is the home, or is the future home for all things W.R. Frady. You can read the Legends of Lacey Road. You will be able to find Darkhaven Manor, the home of the vampire killer, the Wise Oak, which is the home of Balador, and the Island of Igraine, in the world of Aerith. You will also find, hold on a minute, I had to think for a minute, mine went blank. You'll also be able to see Wolf Moon Studios, my personal art gallery, which will also feature other projects, including films, featured artists, other featured authors, and commissioned art as well. So, and let's see, be sure to stop by and visit the Cantankerous Cauldron to see what's brewing and see what's in store for W.R. Frady and anyone of my compatriots that I work with. You'll also be able to find the Ebbenstone Tower itself and just much, much more. I look forward to being able to get this website up and look forward to having each and every one of you come to visit and keep up with the things going on there. Let's see. Well, it's been a dreary couple of days. And what I would like to bring to that is, you ever notice how night changes things? You know, it's like the things you see during the day take on a whole different perspective at night. It's like a child's closet, or the clothes in the corner, that when the light's on, it's just a mirror stack of clothes, a hat hanging on the doorway, a baseball glove back behind the closet door. But when the lights cut off and the shadows fill the room, the clothes suddenly become a shambling mound of inhuman shapelessness that just seems to watch from the shadows. The harmless baseball glove becomes the hand of something waiting to reach out and grab. The hat becomes the shoulders of an unknown creature from unplumbed space, just from far beyond the reaches of our imagination. the window itself takes on an eerie presence in the dark. The limb that harmlessly bats at the window panes during the light of day or when the lights are on suddenly becomes the gnarled and bony claws of some unnameable beast scratching at the window trying to get in. The night holds many mysteries. And that brings us to our stories tonight. Our first story comes from the classic Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and retold as The Thing. You see, Tim and John were amazingly good friends growing up. They always had been. And they did everything together. Well, they were out one evening, just laughing, carrying on, walking down the road. And as the shadows of evening stretched out and covered the land, they found themselves strolling near a turnip field. And as they were walking, they noticed far up ahead something shambling up out of the turnip mound. And then, before it could really stand up, it shuffled back in. And the two looked at each other like, what? What was that? So they continued on walking, and just a couple of seconds later, it come out again. And this time it came to the road, and it stood up like a man. And then, if they weren't mistaken, it looked toward them, but then ran back into the turnips. And as they continued to walk down the road, it shambled out a third time, and this time started to cross the road toward them. And they could see that it wore black suspenders, black trousers and suspenders and a white shirt. But in the bleak light, that was all they could tell. But the fact that it was coming toward them was enough for them to turn, and they took off running. And when they turned around and looked, and wasn't there, they kind of stopped. And they caught their breath for a moment. And they talked amongst each other, and it was like, I really wonder what that thing was. He's like, you know what? Tim said that. He said, I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to touch it. I'm going to try and see if I can get close to it. Well, they went back, and sure enough, not only did it come out of the field again, but this time it came toward them and approached them. And Tim walked up to it and got ready to touch it, and then he looked and saw the sunken features of its face and the leathery skin drawn tight along cheekbones and eyes sunken too deep to be normal, and it looked gaunt and ragged and haggard like a skeleton. And before he could even touch it, he turned and just screamed and took off running. And this time it pursued. And the faster they ran, the faster it kept after them. And then when they finally got to Tim's house, they went inside. And Jerry sat there, and they looked out. And down the road, they saw it coming, and it stopped about midways and looked around, and then turned around and run off into the woods. They never saw anything more of it. But a year or so later, Tim got sick. And Jerry stayed with him every day of that time. And toward the end, right before Tim passed away, Jerry was taken aback as he realized that Tim had begun to look just like the thing they saw come from the field. it was always believed that the night belonged to the dead, while the daylight belonged to the living. It was one of those cyclic patterns that people just followed at one time. This was long before street lamps and lights pushed back the darkness and opened up time for leisurely activities after sundown. There were always tales of things, stranger things that happened out in the night, no pun intended. But the next story comes from Norwegian folklore and dates way back before lights. And this is also a time when dead took its vengeance on the living at times. And this is, I don't know, this one really doesn't have much of a title except for vengeance. You see, there once was a fisherman and his family long, long ago who had already had several children and his wife had given birth to another, and they were already a very, very poor family, relying very much on what little the fisherman could bring in, especially depending on how the fishing was going. Well, they really couldn't take another child in, and often, as cruel as it was, there was custom that they would take a new or a weak or a sick or weakly child and leave it out in the cold of the nights and let the nature kind of take its course. And so they did with this child. Well, in the village, everything seemed normal for a while. And it was quiet, but here and there the villagers would note that they would hear a baby crying off the side of the road. And often around twilight, you could look over and see, travelers would talk about seeing an angry blue form just sitting there shivering in the cold with its fists clenched in rage. Ever so often, such events would spook horses and would frighten the children, and as it for a while it was just a mere nuisance. But then one fateful night, 5 years after the fishermen had carried the newborn out into the cold of the night, he was laying there in bed. The lamps had gone down, ethereal glow flowing in through the windows. And he noticed that the night had grown almost unsettlingly quiet. And short after the middle of the night, he heard the horses getting nervous and start to stamp and move and shuffle restlessly as if a predator was outside stalking their stables. And so the fisherman got up and he looked outside, and all he saw was a strange wisp of a vapor moving along the edge of his yard and along by the barn where the horses' stalls were, and they would nicker and whinny, and they would get really just almost sweatingly nervous. And he could tell that they were upset just by their sounds, but there was nothing out there but that particular little wisp of vapor that seemed to be moving of its own accord. Well, he went back over, and he laid down, and he waited, and started to drift off when he looked up and noticed that a smoke-like wisp was coming through the keyhole of his hut, and it come in, and it went down the door and began to pool at the base of the door. And he noticed that it was an odd bluish color that, much like really, really pale, almost translucent flesh color. And as his eyes widened in horror, he recognized the form that was taking shape. For it was the form of his infant that he had carried out to the cold. And he watched in horror as it crawled little by little, its bared ribs exposed, its angry look on its face as it glared at him and made its way closer, and then it crawled up onto the bed. He watched helplessly as the tiny, what would have been an infant, started climbing up the mother's legs, and she woke up and looked and gasped in horror. But she couldn't move, for the weight of the infant held her held down. And as she looked to her husband, he jumped up to try to grab it and found himself grabbing something just as dense as a rock and as cold as a glacier, and it just had to let go. And the weight of the child crushed his wife's chest as it crawled up through there, blasting the air out of her lungs. And then, as it stared into her face, it reached up and began churning its hands inside of her eye sockets, and then was gone. A pitiful cry come from the fisherman's wife as blood welled up in the eye sockets where her eyes had been. And the infant took her eyesight from her and her breath as well, leaving her crippled. And nothing was ever heard in that village about the child that was carried outside after that night. For it had taken its vengeance. Now, the story is based on the Norse legend of the Utbird, also known as a child carried outside. And it was a specter that was very dangerous in its time. And not often was it always appeased by that. It would also, normally such specters would terrorize others who happened into its territory. But in this case, the vengeance had been solved. But not all mysteries of the night have to be racked with terror and death and vengeance. Sometimes they can be odd meetings of their own. Now, when I opened for my opening night last year, I read native spirits. One of my old stories from the Bazaar of the Bazaar tells of the strange and unnatural. Well, tonight is a retelling of that story. Not a reading, but a retelling. Autumn had blanketed the countryside in rustic hues of orange, gold, reds, and browns. And when the wind would blow, the hillsides were ablaze in autumn color. Jack loved this time of year and often found himself going to the mountains to go hiking or even just driving around to see the fall colors. Well, this year he had come back to a place that he and his father once visited years ago. Matter of fact, it wasn't just once times they visited. They visited on numerous occasions. He remembered it very well in going there as a child and loving it as he would go, and how they would pack a picnic and they would bring the family, and him and his dad would just take the trail and go off to this old waterfall in the woods and just make a day of it. Well, as he followed the trail, remembering the sights and scenes, he would sit there and just look at the rhododendron and when a clearing would come up, see the the rounded tops of the mountains just peering over the trees. The wind would sigh through the forest and just bring with it a little chill that just slipped in through the clothing, but not enough to be cold, but enough to let you know that it was that time of year. He went around a rise in the path and down around a small copse of hardwoods, when he happened to cross a couple of squirrels that were sitting there gathering nuts, and they were startled, ran up the tree and began chittering at him from the tree, and just he kind of laughed at the humor and apologized to him for disturbing their peace, but made his way on. And before long, he heard the telltale chorus of the waters rushing as they went into the waterfall at the basin. Let me get my words right. As the waterfall crashed into the basin to which he was walking. And after the trail snaked around a few patches of rhododendron and magnolia, it opened up, and there was the clearing where the waterfall just rushed from over a hill and into. But wait a minute, gotta let that take care of itself. Anyway, okay. Sorry for the interruption. I'll have to make sure I mute that next time. Anyway, he made his way into the clearing where the waterfall coursed over the small rocky cliff and into the basin. And then he reached into his backpack and pulled out the small lunch and things that he had brought, and just sat back on a log and enjoyed the sceneries, and reminded himself of the memories that flooded his mind as the cool mist from the waterfall just reached out and caressed his skin. And as he ate, he began to think about the times when his father and him would come out there and how they would play and frolic, and his father would tell him stories. And shortly after he finished his food, he found himself just kind of drifting off. And then, once again, he was a little boy at the basin with his father, laughing, feeling the spray of the waterfall line his face, the chill of the autumn air biting through his clothes, and the laughter. And as a tiny rivulet and the wind blew, he jolted awake and realized, he was awake, and he didn't realize he had nodded off, and he had stayed longer than he meant to, for twilight had settled in over the woods. And the waterfall was aglow with the ethereal light of the night, but the shadows had encroached upon the woodlands, taking most of his vision from him, and he didn't think to bring a flashlight because he wasn't planning on being here this long. So he began to fumble and make his way back down the trail, trying to feel his way back to the vehicle. Well, it wasn't long before night had fully fallen over, and he had not found his way back, and he was still settling. He was still trying to find his way through. And to his dismay, he began to hear some things moving around him in the dark. The crash of a bush, the snap of a twig, and it sounded like, dogs, or maybe something was following him. And off in the distance, he heard the howl of a wolf. And he was like, oh no. I'm out here with nothing, no light, nothing, and now there's wolves out and they're howling. And he heard another, and he began trying to hurry up and find his way back to his vehicle. And he went up and over hills and around bushes and got smacked in the face by a rhododendron. And then up ahead, as though he kept hearing the animals following him, it was as if they were pacing him. And then he saw a flicker of a light in the distance, and he thought maybe it's a car light that I'm seeing. So he followed the flicker and watched over and made sure he took his steps carefully so he wouldn't step in a hole and turn his ankle, or trip over a bush or a limb, or step on something he didn't want to step on. Until eventually he approached, and he was within a good eye view of what was a fire. And he knew he was lost. So he walked over and went into the fire, and he saw people, kind of what looked to be Native Americans, dancing around the fire and sitting, talking and telling stories. And as he approached, the crowd quietened down. They turned and looked at him. And the chief beckoned to him, told him, come inside. And he apologized for happening in and explained how he had come to visit a place that he found such a connection with as a child and had memories with, and then he just fell asleep and got lost. And the chief just kind of giggled and just kind of chuckled and bade the others to bring him food and drink, and they set him next to the fire so that he could get warm and dry. And as he watched, the Cherokee danced around the fire, and they told stories and of legends and heroes and of mythic adventures, and they told the tales of their people. And as he watched it unfold, they were kept dancing around and stuff. And he found that the blanket that they had put on him was very comfortable. And then once again, as he dried and got warm, and from the feeling of the food, he dozed off. And in his mind, he was running through and in his dreams, he was running through the woods, and the wolves were howling around him and chasing him and pacing him, and they were running together, and he was running from them. And then he passed the waterfall and the basin where he had visited, and just as he was running around copse of trees, a large wolf jumped out and a small snapped right at him, and he woke up. And it was in the dim, still, chill light of the morning. He was still wrapped in the doeskin blanket that had been brought to him. The fire had long since burned out. But as he looked around the clearing, there was never any trace of any Indian encampment. There was no sign of anyone having been there. Yet, around the entirety of the camp, of the clearing, were wolf tracks. Only his footprints were the only humans there. As he got up and he stumbled and he turned around, he examined it. And then as he exited the clearing, and within 20, 30 yards, found that he was at the side of the road, close to where his car had once been, or where his car was. And that was native spirits. You see, ever so often, even the mysteries of the night, not all of them are grand and terrible. Some of them can be quite mysteries indeed. I thank you for joining me tonight. Things were a little crazy and hectic due to some scheduling and things that took place. And I thank you, each and every one of you, for bearing with me. I appreciate all that you've done and all that you do in coming on here, watching my stories and supporting me. See. I would like to give a few shout outs before I jump off of here for the night. I would like to thank my friends, Moonrunner83. I'd like to congratulate Moonrunner83's awesome friend, good musicians, amazing musician, good friend, and just great supporter. And I'm thankful to have him there. And if you haven't heard any of his music, definitely iTunes, Spotify, or Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, man, definitely give Moonrunner a check him out. Check out their music. Megan McDuffie, who just released her Atari CD, definitely good friend. Give her go check out her music. Matter of fact, she did the soundtrack, composed and performed the soundtrack for River City Girls, and now River City Girls 2 coming out in 2022, as well as doing work for Atari, as far as music work for Atari. And she's got many other musical projects that she does as well, including does some collaborations with Moonrunner83 and Clayton Celldweller and many others. So yeah, definitely good friend and give Megan McDuffie some good support. Another one, I'd like to give a shout out to each and every one of you that come on here, listen to my stories, even when I'm kind of rambling like I did tonight and things with everything being out of whack. I still thank you. We're human. We all have those nights, and I still hope you had an enjoyable time listening to the stories. And again, I'd like to give a shout out to The Devil's Daughter, premiering at the Golden Ticket Cinemas on October 30th. There's limited tickets available. The proceeds go to Gracious Hands to fight against domestic violence and to help families get restarted and get a new beginning, to get away from the horrors of domestic violence. Also, would like to give a shout out to my friends at the Dusk series. Season 4 is getting ready to be underway of filming. Trying to think of again, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for jumping on board, and especially having to start later than usual, which kind of threw everything out of whack. But hey, life happens, and man, we just got to grab it and go. Always fight to make the world a better place. Be what you want to see in the world as a better place. Don't just fight to make the world a better place. Be what you want to see the world as a better place. Have a wonderful evening. Tune in next time. Remember, EbbenStoneTower.com, home for all things W.R. Frady, coming late 2021, is under construction. It's the home for everything from the World of Aerith, the Vampire Killer Tales, Legends of Lacey Road, and Wolf Moon Studios, and much, much more. Again, I'd like to thank everyone, and I appreciate you tuning in. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week. Be good, be safe, enjoy the autumn weather. There's only a couple of more weeks of ghost stories by the Fireside left. Let's rock them and have a good weekend. Thank you for joining me. God bless. Till next time. Peace out, everyone.